welcome to Connecting Conversations with Family Fuse, where we connect with members of the community to gain insight onto how to build a better future for all. I'm Christy Nelson.
And I'm Jadlyn Spooner. And today we're talking with Derrick Drouillard, the Executive Director of WECAS, which is the Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society. Derrick Drouillard has been working in child welfare for the last 30 years. Good morning, Derrick, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. It's an honor to be with you this morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So first off, just tell us a little bit about WECAS and how it serves the community.
Great. Yeah, Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society is one of 38 we call mainstream children's aid societies in the province of Ontario. There's also some Indigenous well-being agencies that serve their Indigenous communities that are also legislated under the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, which we are. And our role is to look after the best interest, protection, and well-being of children under the age of 18 in Windsor-Essex. And also certainly our other primary purposes are to strengthen families and communities and work alongside to be the best partners we can to support children, youth, and families in the community. So we are designated under the legislation to provide that service for Windsor-Essex.
That's amazing. And why did you decide to work for WECAS?
Coming to WECAS was coming home for me. So I grew up in Windsor-Essex and I left many years ago and worked for 3 other children's aid societies over my career. And in 2018, this opportunity came up and so I returned home. And so it's a great opportunity for me to come back to my roots and to be back to this great community. And so it all converged in a good way for me to get back home. So I looked forward to the challenge of working in this organization because it is rather a large organization, and it was an opportunity for me to continue to grow and develop as a person who works in child welfare.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking about child welfare and the foster care system have been shown in the media as being problematic and flawed. So how does WECAS create a healthy and safe environment for children in the system to counteract that?
That's a great question. And yes, the history of child welfare in Ontario, certainly we know that the system was created alongside with other colonialized practices. And so child welfare in Ontario has a history of using power over people. And so we have a history where we understand the systemic racism is alive and well in child welfare, and it's our job to tackle that in a very meaningful and forward-thinking way. And so we understand that our history and our legacy is such that it would, for a number of groups and a number of communities, have them pause for concern about able to work with us, trust us. Are we doing things that are counter for their communities, or are we doing things to actually further the best interest and work alongside? And so there are flaws in the system, and I would say that especially in the last I would say short future or short past, there's been considerable growth and development and understanding around equity and the role that child welfare plays in becoming an equitable ally and partner with communities rather than agents of authority. And that's where we are trying to transform and redesign our services and our service delivery so that we're better community partners. So we understand the concerns from our history, and we have the more acknowledgement of that today than we ever had. And I think we have the tools and the partnerships to move forward in a better way.
Awesome. Some families' biggest fears when working with CIS is that their children will be taken away from them. Again, adding on to kind of that negative viewpoint in the media and in the community. But can you tell us some of the myths about WECAS and the children in its care?
Yeah, for sure. So over 90% of the children we serve are not in care. They live with their families in the communities. And so our goal more and more, as we've unpacked our own service delivery model, is looking at prevention and early intervention. And how do we actually keep children with their families in the community, and that they're the architects of their own intervention, and we're facilitators of change, support, and services. And so with that, having said that, we certainly are always looking for opportunity to provide our legislative obligation and our obligation to the community, alongside with knowing that the best way to do that is to keep children with their families. So we look for every opportunity to work with families, and if for whatever host of reasons why families require that support, where they may not be in the best position to care for their own children, their kin can, their communities can. And so how do we act in a way that we keep families together, and only in the most dire and situations where safety is at imminent risk would we consider alternative care, formal care. But we think that those situations can almost always be managed in the community with the families and their kin. And so certainly a myth would be that all children who we come in contact with come into care, and that's just clearly not the case. The bulk of our work is working with families in the community, and not for reasons of significant abuse and neglect, but because families are facing big social problems, and it's our job to help identify and support them in those. And those social problems include child and adult mental health issues, adult addiction issues, intimate personal violence, or intimate partner violence. Poverty is actually one of the biggest drivers to the work of child welfare. And we know that families that are experiencing poverty get identified disproportionately to almost all other families in the community for referrals to children's aid societies. And so you shouldn't have to have child welfare involved in your life because you're experiencing poverty. And it's our job to assess better what might look like other things, in fact, might be poverty that families experiencing. What do we do as a community towards that? I think the days of saying child welfare should be over, and we should be talking about the welfare of children in the community. And that's how we're trying to redesign our own services.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for people listening who may have kind of those negative viewpoints about WECAS or just child welfare in general. But what are some of the social problems and reasons why people call WECAS, and who are they typically calling for? Do they call for themselves? Do they call for others, maybe children?
So we have we keep quite a track and list of referral sources. So you can imagine that those agencies or those institutions in the community have the most contact with children tend to be our higher referral sources, like the school system, like policing, and like other support services. And we also have a category of community members that might call. They might call anonymously, like they're worried about a child in their neighborhood, or they're a family member that don't want to identify themselves, but they're worried for a niece, a nephew, a grandchild. But most of our referrals do come from professional referral sources. And those buckets of big problems, social problems that I referenced earlier, I think are the main drivers, in addition to understanding, and we're doing much better at unpacking this. For example, there's an overrepresentation and disproportionality of referrals that come to the agency for Indigenous and Black families. And so we have to look into the systemic racism within the community, where why are those families being disproportionately referred to child welfare? And it doesn't mean that those families, and Indigenous and Black families, are worse parents, or are managing, are abusing or neglecting their children at greater rates. Not at all. It's about systemic racism and how they're viewed in the community, and then therefore over-reporting to child welfare. So it's our job, as one of our main strategies within the next year, is to really reach out to our referral sources and also do some joint work together with those communities to say, what is the best way to help those families, and why are those referrals coming in at a disproportional rate than other communities?
Yeah, that's great work that you guys are doing over there. So once someone is referred, what would be the process of a child becoming part of the child welfare system?
Yeah, so once a call is made, it comes through our screening team, and the screening team listens to the concerns as presented by the referral source, and they go through a number of checks and balances in order to come to some determination of whether the call and the concerns, the worries for children meet the criteria to be open for child protection work. They do record checks, thorough record checks, and they would look at the information, ask some additional questions, and see if there's other services that are more appropriate to support the family versus coming to child welfare. So let's say on a given year, we get X number of referrals, half of those actually If it's 3,000 in a year, half of those do not get through to Child Protection Services. We refer those back out into the community. And we think that families are better served with those support services and resources. And then of those ones that go through an assessment or an investigation, maybe about 20 to 25% of those actually go on to our ongoing services. So they might be closed at our initial investigation or assessment phase of the work, which is roughly 0 to 60 days, depending on how quickly the assessment material can be pulled together. So the referrals come in where there's identified concern or worry for a child. We determine at the front end whether the concerns merit a child protection response, and then go ahead and open it if it does, and then determine whether it's going to be a situation we can close within a short period of time, or one where we offer ongoing services in order to best support children, youth, and families.
Mhm. Now, Derrick, you had mentioned earlier about the school system and policing being the majority of the referral agencies. Family Fuse works with Black Canadian parents, guardians, and caregivers to navigate the education system. And so, as you mentioned before, WECAS also works with the education system. Could you just talk a little bit about that for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple of ways where we do this. One is that we have a joint protocol with the school boards, all the local school boards, and that's a province-wide protocols where we work together for the children and youth that we service on our protection files, and of course those that are in care, to try to strengthen the educational opportunities for families that we service. And that would include our Black families in the community as well. And in addition, we have an educational liaison role in the organization, which is there to support especially children in care, but also those not in care, to help with their attaining their educational goals and strengthen and navigating a really cumbersome system sometimes, similar to child welfare, which can be very complex as well. And so our work, and we have tutoring programs, we have homework programs, we provide lots of, in this day and age of virtual schooling, we provide lots of opportunity for devices and things that support education for the families that we serve. We have a very generous community, so we've also, through our foundation's work, received some grants for things like educational support that we send back out to the families that we serve. And of course, partnering with other organizations such as Family Fuse, and really understanding that you guys are the expert in this area. So how do we partner with you? And I'd rather sort of work through a Family Fuse and support your organization than try and reinvent things that we're trying to do here that you'll do better. And so we do have lots of ways that we're supporting the education of children, youth, and families. We obviously, when I reference poverty being a big issue, we know that education is one of the biggest drivers out of poverty. And so how do we best support those opportunities? Better to do that with children and family in their homes, with their families in the community. Children who come into care and grow up in foster care, their graduation rates out of high school are almost half than those in the general population. So we know that we have to do a better job working with families rather than bringing children into care and working through that pathway.
Okay. Now, earlier you mentioned that Indigenous and Black families are highly reported, and the thought is that systemic racism is part of this process of these reports. Could you just talk a little bit about that, and what percentage of children are in the care of WECAS? And is this more or less than other ethnicities, which I believe you answered earlier, but how did we get to this number? So I guess that's 3 questions in one.
No worries, yeah. And so here's the situation where I don't have confidence in the integrity of our data right now. So we have a system that is set up where it's not intuitive for us to do the right data collection to know. So I have some visibility on what the disproportionality is of, say, Black children, Black youth, and children in care. And that tells me, when I look at it from face value, is that the disproportionality is low for our agency in Windsor-Essex. But yet, I know that our data is flawed. I know that our staff still are not always asking the right questions and understanding equity and race and identity, race-based collection to properly populate that data so we actually know. So while it looks like from the surface we might not have a disproportionality issue, I'm not confident that that's in fact true when I understand that we have a flawed mechanism right now of data collection. So one of the things that we're concentrating on with this year is cleaning that up and doing a much better job at identifying our data metrics properly, and trying to find a way to make the system that we have to work in match the effort of trying to become more comprehensive about the data that we have. But we also know from practice and from the data that we are able to collect, there is, and we know this across the province, so Windsor wouldn't be unique from the provincial lens, which is there is a disproportionality of reports made to child welfare for Indigenous and Black families. So we know if we start from that base, we have to then do the work to unpack our own data and understand that, so we can then impact it. Because once we know it, you can't unknow it, and then you can make action happen from that. In fact, we know that's true. I'll give you an example. We did do a deep dive in our legal review recently, and what we found was disproportionality of Black families entering the legal realm with us. So now that we understand and know that information, we've got to find the action points to interrupt that, to unpack it, understand it, and to break through the systemic racism, so that we're not continuing to further that kind of action, that kind of systemic racism practices. So we own that, and we have to do something about that.
That leads to my next question. What is the answer to doing something about this?
One of the big pieces of the answer for me is understanding our equity journey and doing a much better job of incorporating those all good equity practices in our work every single day. And that starts from all areas of the organization, with our senior team, with our management team, with our frontline staff, with our board of directors. All of us have to become experts in equity. We have to understand the impact of our services on the most marginalized and racialized families that we serve, and how do we do something about it. Starts with me as the executive director of this organization, understanding my own privilege as a white male in society, and all the other privilege points I have in my life, and therefore not using power over people because of, or trying to understand the experience when I don't have those experiences, those lived experiences happening for me on a daily basis. And so part of it is our growth of competency in that area. The other is then building in equitable practices in the organization with a number of checks and balances. And that is looking at all of our practices, including our policies, our HR practices, our retention practices, and how we work with families. And so, it's monumental, but child welfare is the work of equity. Part of what we do is serve those families where they're as I say, marginalized and more challenged in our community. We have to do that in a better way, and we have to do that with much stronger partnerships with others in the community to make that happen. So it's been, you mentioned early on 30 years in child welfare. I feel like I've got about a good 10 years left in me, and I want the last 10 years to be a far better reflection of the work than the first 30. And so that's the challenge ahead of us as we're moving forward with this redesign of our service.
Yeah, so some of the great work that is being done is through an initiative called One Vision, One Voice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, One Vision, One Voice was created by Black communities in association with our Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. So this is a project that has been established in order to identify and help us to embed and implement 11 race-based practices. And that is, while its focus is on anti-Black racism, obviously the principles of those practices are good for all those community members that we serve. And so we are in phase 3 of affectionately we refer to as OVOV. And in that phase 3, it's our implementation phase. So we're looking at how do we now embed and implement these practices. The phase 1 was a lot about your own learning, education, and assessment of your organization and where we're at. Phase 2 was starting to build the competencies and build the training so that we could ready ourselves to deliver on phase 3, which we're just starting now in partnership with the OACAS. So we are putting together our project team and our work plan in order to embed those practices. We keep a scorecard to determine how we're doing, because accountability is really important when we're looking at these things. How are we doing, so that when we have our report card, we can report that back to the community. I think we have a responsibility to demonstrate back to the community that we are embedding these practices, implementing them, and we have to hold the mirror up to ourselves, but we also have to be accountable to the community as well.
Yes, accountability is extremely important. I just reiterate those words. Whatever system we're in, accountability is huge in just moving forward with positive action. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the system, the child welfare system, since the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's and others, as well as the attention being brought to Black Lives Matter movement. Um, what's the environment been like in the child welfare system since those incidents or since those traumatic events, and how is everybody supporting one another? I know that there are, people of color who work for the Children's Aid Society. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you're supporting one another to ensure that, it's a healthy environment that takes the time for people to reflect and take self-care into consideration and these sorts of things.
Yes, we have an internal the acronym is BACC, Black African Caribbean committee within our organization. So we have a number of our Black staff who belong to that, and as a leadership group, including myself, we've been meeting with our staff on a monthly basis. There's always been an effort to meet and communicate. That has increased tenfold since the death of George Floyd and that incident that occurred, as you say, the murder of George Floyd in the summer. It has had incredible impact on all. But I reached out to our staff early on just to check in. How are you doing with this? And they were sharing their own feelings, thoughts, and stories that were clearly the trauma impact was very high. We knew we had to come together quickly and support one another, and so we've done that. Our staff meet regularly. They're part of a larger association. Our Ontario Association of Children's Aid put together a number of Black staff-only forums in order for staff to get together and talk about their experiences, and also to look for opportunity for change and enhancements and supports. And so we've been meeting regularly with our staff, but it was certainly a difficult summer in that regard. You roll this with the pandemic, and you can see the toll that it's taking on all of us, but particularly those staff. So as much as the pandemic has impacted everyone personally, it impacts especially Indigenous and Black communities even at a more alarming rate. And we see that with the statistics in the States as well as in Canada. And so our staff are courageous and strong and inspirational. I feel like when I go to the meetings with staff, I end up taking away more than I leave behind, because I'm so moved by their strength and want to make a difference and do things better. And if I've done anything to open a platform for conversation, then I'm happy to do that. But they've really challenged us as a leadership group to look at some changes internally that we're working with them on a work plan and implementing. And so you can't over support in this regard. You can't over message. It's really conversations that have been tough, but necessary. And so I think it's had the tragicness of all this. We can't let lie without action now, without doing something about this. We can't just check in and say, are you okay? Is everything okay? What can I do to help? But not do something different, not be different, act different. And so I send out messages to the staff as a whole group about we must do better, act better, and be better. This is not optional. And so we continue to work towards unpacking our role in being an organization that contributes to systemic racism and trying to right that ship. And I think our staff are being true leaders and moving us in that direction.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned COVID-19 and the pandemic and how that is impacting your staff. How have services changed or adapted to our new circumstances as it relates to servicing the community?
Yeah, it's been a real challenge. The first wave of the pandemic, even though the second wave has proven itself to be more deadly and more serious, The first wave was a bit more of a bigger challenge because it came at us and we weren't ready for this. There was no playbook on this. There's no manual about how to provide services during a pandemic. And we were all scrambling. Do we have PPE? What does it even mean to use PPE? Well, the knowledge of the disease and its virus and its spread was different. So we know more now. We have, during the first wave, we moved to virtual platforms on almost everything we did. We were trying our best to anticipate what to expect, listening to the best information from public health organizations, and in establishing protocols and processes. So as the second wave hit, and we have had all those practices established, those protocols put into place, we have plenty of PPE, we understand more about the virus, working with public health, we've been able to continue to do face-to-face work. We saw a significant decrease in our referrals, a significant decrease in a number of our investigations that we did. But now we're able to continue to provide, because we are an essential service, provide that service and try to keep staff as safe as possible at the same time, and the service users that we come in contact with. And so we've are in a bit of a hybrid model right now, considering the lockdown and the state of emergency in Windsor-Essex. But we are offering both virtual and face-to-face services, depending on the particular case and the risk levels and whatever assessment, clinical observations that we have. So I think this second wave, we're far better prepared. And while we want to go back to a place where I think our work is so much about human interactions and working alongside people in a face-to-face way, we desperate to get back to those times, but we also have to understand our responsibility to limit the spread of the virus as well. We have a responsibility towards that. Our building is on virtual lockdown in the sense of like 90% or better of our staff are working from home and working remotely. We aren't carrying on meetings in the building any longer. All of our board meetings, for example, are on a virtual platform, and we only have a small percentage of footprint in the building. Myself, I come into the office every day, almost, or at least 3 out of the 5 days, and work from home some of those other times. But we do try to limit exposure within the building. We are continue to have some of our visits with our families and children, if the children are in formal care at the building, if we don't have other options. So we've definitely had to alter things substantially, but I think we're actually in a fairly good place in terms of where we are with the pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic certainly has been life-changing, and a call to action to keep everybody safe and staying at home. So speaking of changing lives, how does WECAS change children's lives?
That's a great question, and I would like to think that first and foremost, it's with each individual in the organization, and how we work with families. We should see the work that we do with families as a privilege. We're privileged to work alongside through the journey of families. In 30 years in child welfare, I have seen some of the most tragic and heart-wrenching situations, and obviously seen some of the most inspirational and understanding the strength and courage of people who face such adversity and yet carry on and do things to improve their own lives. And so when you are along for that journey, you have to take those things very carefully and sincerely. And so I hope part of the change we do is that each staff member will work and respect and honor the families, and work with them in such a way that we understand their strengths. Every family has strengths and safety. We just have to either look for it with them or help them find it themselves. And then in those situations where the risk to children is so high, we've got to find a way to keep children connected to their families, bringing children into care. And if they end up changing placements, often this is a detriment to their attachment, and we can't be part of the problem. We have to be part of the solution. And so I hope we change lives by understanding that children are best with their families, they're best with their communities. We can offer a supportive role, we can offer a helping hand and guidance, but we're best to partner with and not, it's sort of the saying is nothing about them without them. We cannot be the ones to dictate things for families. And so I think with, notwithstanding the legislative requirement we have, I think social work in this regard, or child protection work, has to come from the heart in lots of ways. And we need to be understanding that our work with families is certainly a privilege and an honor, and we need to respect the dignity and the self-worth of families. Those folks are worth doing business with. Let us be facilitators of change. I always said to families I worked with when I was a frontline worker many years ago, my job is to get fired from you. So what can we do so that you can fire me from your home?
Right. So strengthening families so that they can, fire you is the goal.
Is the
Okay.
goal, yes.
So in saying that, what types of support or programs does WECAS offer for the children and families that
Yeah.
it serves?
Yeah. So a plethora of things. And one of the things that I like a lot about what we do is we call them family well-being workers, workers that go directly into the homes and work directly with families in order to strengthen either their understanding of caregiving skills or their caregiving knowledge, work through tough things like addiction and mental health and support them through that, provide them with opportunities to enhance their ability to understand and help their kids regulate their own behavior. I think the goal for all of our parents is that children learn about their own regulation, so that we can see them grow and develop and understand that their behavior is within their control as they grow and mature and develop. And so supporting families with strategies around those things. We help families with resources and services, both the resources of support and financial in ways that can support the ways that they need to be successful with their own families. We have homework programs and volunteers and mentors. We have, through our foundation, we do a lot of fundraising around things like sending kids to camp in the summers. Our holiday program has been wildly successful this year again, and just a real call on our community who came together to support, especially in COVID. We thought the holiday program this year was going to suffer considerably because of the pandemic, but in fact, it's the opposite. People came forward, how can we help? We were able to sponsor almost 685 families this year. Those, again, are those families that are on our ongoing protection cases, not kids in care, supporting them through the holiday program. And so, we do look for ways to community partners have come forward this year and asked if we can partner with them to support families. And so we've been able to do that as well. So a whole host of ways to provide that support and services, and open to continuing to hear more. So what we can do to be a good partner, good allies, where we're aiming to achieve.
Earlier, Jadelyn had talked about the perception of Children's Aid Society in the community. I want to know, with all these services, what is the biggest hope of the society in terms of the way they're perceived by the public and the changes that we know we're currently working on making through the Children's Aid Society? What is the hope for the perception, the new perception?
Well, I think you said it. It's hope. It's that I would like the community to see us as an organization that they feel good about, confident about reaching out to, that we're here to help, that we're here to offer hope, that we're here to walk alongside the journey and not do harm, but support and work with families in a good way. If the community's healthy, if the community's thriving, if the community grassroots organizations and other services have the resources and families have quick access to those things, those social determinants of child welfare, poverty and mental health and addictions and intimate partner violence and marginalization, if the community has, then the work of child welfare shrinks. And we would need less of child welfare and have more of the community integration model. And so working ourselves out of a job in lots of ways, so that it's a signal to me of a healthy community that's taking care of its own when the work of child welfare shrinks and becomes the work of welfare of children in the community. So that is where I would hope we would get to, a place where we can be part of the broader solution and not be the authority, the the history that we are, and that we've moved forward in a good way.
Okay, Derrick. Well, thank you very much. We have a lot of work to do, a lot of positive outcomes to achieve. So we thank you today for joining us. And Jadelyn, thank you for joining us as well as our co-host. We look forward to the conversations happening in the future. And thank you all for listening.